The black cop was dying alone, and every witness on that street saw it happen. Officer Morgan Thompson lay slumped against a yellow brick wall, her blood pooling fast beneath her, her badge catching the last golden light of day like a cruel joke. 5 police officers stood 100 feet away, 5 trained men with weapons drawn. Not one of them took a single step toward her, and the only person walking in her direction was Curtis Bone, the most feared Mafia boss in the state, the man every cop in the city had been trying to bury for 20 years. Curtis should have kept walking. Every rule of the streets demanded it. She was the enemy. The badge, the system that had hunted his family, locked up his brother, and stood frozen while his mother bled out on a cracked sidewalk when he was 16 years old. But something in Morgan's eyes stopped him cold. Not just fear, not just pain. Something worse. The look of a woman realizing that the people who were supposed to save her weren't coming. And in that moment, Curtis didn't see a cop anymore. He saw his mother, dying the same way, alone, abandoned, waiting for help that never arrived. The next 30 seconds would force Curtis Bone to make an impossible choice: remain the monster everyone believed he was, or become the one thing he swore he'd never be again. He crouched beside her. The officers in the distance shifted. Radios crackled. But still, no one moved. Whether they were frozen by fear of the notorious crime boss or something far more sinister, Curtis didn't know yet. He only knew that Morgan Thompson's breath was rattling, her hand trembling over a service weapon she couldn't lift, and her eyes, dark, terrified, fading, were locked onto his like he was her final hope in a world that had already given up on her. If you're already hooked, hit like and tell me where you're watching from. It helps this story reach more people. Curtis tore off his leather jacket, the symbol of everything he had become, and pressed it hard against the wound in her side. He could feel her blood soaking through the leather, hot and relentless. His men were watching from a black SUV at the corner. The cops were watching from their safe distance. The whole world was watching, and none of them understood what was happening inside him. 20 years ago, Curtis had screamed for help while his mother bled out on a sidewalk 6 blocks from here. The police never came. Not to their neighborhood. Not for a black woman caught in crossfire she had nothing to do with. She died in his arms while sirens wailed somewhere far away, never close enough to matter. That night, the boy who believed in mercy died with her, and Curtis Bone was born. He had spent 2 decades burying that boy, building walls, building an empire, becoming untouchable because the world had taught him that softness got you killed. But now, with Morgan's blood on his hands and her life slipping away beneath his palms, every wall he had built was crumbling. Because this wasn't about cops and criminals anymore. This was about a woman dying alone while the people who should save her stood frozen, and Curtis had already lived that nightmare once. He wasn't going to watch it happen again. "You're not dying here," he said, his voice low and rough. "Not today, not like this." Her eyes flickered. Recognition. Confusion. She knew who he was. She knew what he was. And still her trembling hand released her weapon and gripped his arm instead, because he was all she had. Curtis looked up at the officers, still rooted in place. Cowards or conspirators. He didn't care which. He slid his arms beneath Morgan, lifted her against his chest, and rose to his feet. Her head fell against his shoulder. Her blood smeared across his neck. And then he started walking. Toward his enemies. Toward judgment. Toward whatever hell came next. If you want more stories that hit this hard, make sure to subscribe. Because Curtis Bone had already watched one woman die while the world stood still. He would not watch another. 20 years earlier, the night was warm, and the street smelled like rain that hadn't fallen yet. Curtis was 16, lanky, soft around the edges in ways he didn't know yet. He was walking home with his mother from the corner store, a gallon of milk in one hand and a bag of groceries in the other. Gloria Bone was humming something, a hymn from Sunday service, the same one she always hummed when she was tired but trying not to show it. She worked 2 jobs, cleaned office buildings before dawn, and waited tables until her feet swelled, but she never complained. Not once. "Almost home, baby," she said, squeezing his shoulder. "I'll make you those pancakes you like in the morning." Curtis smiled. He was thinking about pancakes and about the girl in his chemistry class and about whether the Knicks would make the playoffs. Normal things. The kinds of thoughts a 16-year-old was supposed to have. Then the world exploded. Gunfire, 3 shots, maybe 4, coming from somewhere down the block, a turf war between crews Curtis didn't belong to, over territory his family had nothing to do with. He didn't even see the shooter, just heard the cracks splitting the night air like thunder. And then his mother made a sound he would never forget. A gasp. A small, soft exhale, like she was surprised by something. She stumbled. Her hand slipped off his shoulder. Curtis turned just in time to catch her as she fell. "Mama?" Blood, so much blood, spreading across her white blouse like a flower blooming in fast forward. Her eyes were wide, confused, searching his face like she was trying to understand what had happened. "Mama, no, 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 no!" Curtis lowered her to the sidewalk, his hands shaking so hard he could barely hold her. The milk jug had cracked open, white pooling around them, mixing with red. He pressed his hands against her chest, against the wound, but the blood just kept coming, hot and relentless, slipping through his fingers no matter how hard he pressed. "Help!" He screamed it so loud his voice cracked. "Somebody help, please!" The street was empty. Doors stayed closed. Curtains didn't move. This was the kind of neighborhood where gunshots meant you stayed inside and thanked God it wasn't you. Curtis screamed again. And again. Until his throat was raw and his voice was barely a rasp. He looked down the block, desperate, praying for flashing lights, sirens, anything. Nothing came. 6 blocks away, he would later learn, 2 patrol cars were parked outside a convenience store. The officers heard the shots. They logged the call. And they waited. Because this neighborhood wasn't worth the risk. Because people here shot back. Because a black woman bleeding on concrete wasn't enough to make them move. Gloria's hand found his face. Weak. Trembling. She was trying to smile, but her lips kept slipping. "Curtis, baby. Don't talk, Mama. Help is coming. Just hold on. Please, just hold on. You got a good heart." Her voice was fading, each word costing her something she couldn't afford to spend. "Don't let them take it from you. Be better than this world, baby. Be better than what it makes you." Her hand slipped from his cheek. Her eyes stayed open, but the light behind them went out. Curtis held her for a long time after that. Minutes, maybe hours. He didn't know. He just sat there on the cracked sidewalk, covered in his mother's blood, rocking her like she used to rock him when he was small and scared, and the world felt too big. The sirens finally came. 43 minutes too late. By then, something inside Curtis had died alongside his mother. The boy who believed in goodness. The boy who trusted that help would come. The boy who thought the world had rules that protected people like them. That boy bled out on the pavement with Gloria Bone. And in his place, something harder took its first breath. Something cold. Something that would never wait for help again. Something that would never be soft enough to lose someone like this twice. That night, Curtis Bone was reborn. Curtis dropped to his knees beside her, and the concrete bit through his jeans like a reminder of where he was, what he was doing, how wrong this was by every law of the streets he had built his life on. Morgan's eyes found his face. Confusion first, then recognition. He watched the moment she realized who was kneeling over her. The most wanted man in the city. the name mothers whispered to scare their children into behaving, the monster the police department had spent 2 decades trying to cage. Her hand twitched toward her weapon. "Don't," Curtis said, his voice low. "I'm not here to hurt you." She didn't have the strength to reach the gun anyway. Her arm fell back to the pavement, and something like surrender washed across her face. Not trust, not yet. Just the exhaustion of a woman who had run out of options. Curtis looked down at the wound. Bad. Very bad. A bullet had torn through her side, and the blood was coming faster than her body could afford to lose it. She had minutes. Maybe less. And the officers standing 100 feet away still hadn't moved. He could feel their eyes on him, could feel their radios crackling with chatter he couldn't hear. They were watching, waiting. For what? For her to die? For him to finish her off and give them a reason to finally pull their triggers? Curtis didn't know. Didn't care. He reached up and gripped the collar of his leather jacket, the jacket he had worn every day for 15 years. It wasn't just clothing. It was armor. It was identity. The black leather had become as synonymous with Curtis Bone as the tattoos crawling up his arms. When he walked into a room wearing that jacket, men twice his size lowered their eyes. Deals got made. Debts got paid. Wars got won. And now he was pulling it off his shoulders for a dying cop. The cool air hit his arms, his chest. He felt exposed in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. But he didn't hesitate. He folded the jacket, pressed it hard against Morgan's wound, and leaned his weight into it. She gasped. Pain. But pain meant she was still alive. "Stay with me," Curtis said. "You hear me? Stay with me." A car door opened somewhere behind him. Curtis didn't need to turn around to know who it was. "Boss?" The voice belonged to Darnell, his second in command. 20 years of loyalty. 20 years of watching Curtis build an empire with cold calculation and zero sentiment. "Boss, what the hell are you doing?" Curtis didn't answer. "That's a cop." Darnell's voice was climbing, panic bleeding through the edges. "Curtis, that's a cop. The boys are watching. The whole block is watching. You can't—" "Go back to the car, Darnell. If you save her, everything changes. You understand that? The crews will talk. The families will talk. You'll look weak. You'll look—" "I said go back to the car." The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut. Curtis could feel Darnell's stare boring into his back, could feel the weight of everything this moment was about to cost him. The respect, the fear. The empire built on the principle that Curtis Bone showed mercy to no one. All of it was bleeding out onto the pavement alongside Morgan Thompson. And Curtis didn't care. He pressed harder on the wound. Morgan's breath was shallow, her eyes fluttering. She was slipping, fading, going somewhere he couldn't follow. "Not today," he whispered. The words came from somewhere deep, somewhere he thought he had sealed off forever. "You're not dying today. Not like this, not like my mother." Morgan's eyes opened. Just a sliver. Just enough to see him. She didn't speak. But something passed between them in that moment, an understanding that neither of them could name. Two people who had spent their whole lives on opposite sides of a war, suddenly bound by blood and desperation and the simple human need to not die alone. Behind him, Darnell retreated to the car. The cops still hadn't moved. And Curtis Bone, the monster of the city, held a dying woman in his arms and refused to let go. She was fading. Curtis could feel it in the way her body went slack against his arms, the way her breathing turned shallow and irregular, the way her grip on his forearm loosened like she was letting go of something she no longer had the strength to hold. He couldn't wait any longer. Curtis slid one arm beneath her knees, the other behind her back, and lifted. Morgan wasn't a small woman, but adrenaline made her feel weightless. Or maybe it was something else. something older and deeper that had taken hold of him the moment he saw her lying against that wall. He rose to his feet, with her cradled against his chest, his leather jacket still pressed against her wound, now soaked through with blood that dripped onto the concrete with every step he took. And then Curtis Bone did something no one on that street ever expected to see. He started walking toward the cops. The officers saw him coming. 5 of them, frozen in a loose semicircle near their patrol cars, weapons half drawn, faces caught somewhere between confusion and fear. They had been trained for a lot of things: active shooters, high-speed chases, armed standoffs, but nothing in the academy had prepared them for this. The most dangerous man in the city walking straight at them with a bleeding officer in his arms. Curtis didn't slow down, didn't stop, didn't say a word. He just kept walking. 30 feet. 20. 10. The officers parted like water. They didn't holster their weapons, but they didn't raise them either. They just moved. Stepped aside, let him pass. Like they were watching something they couldn't quite process, something that didn't fit into any category their minds knew how to handle. One of them, young, fresh-faced, probably 6 months out of the academy, opened his mouth like he was about to speak. Curtis's eyes locked onto his, and the words died in the kid's throat. Curtis reached the first patrol car. The door was unlocked. The keys were in the ignition. Sloppy. Careless. Exactly what he needed. He pulled open the back door and laid Morgan across the seat as gently as he could, keeping pressure on the wound with one hand while he positioned her with the other. She groaned, a small, broken sound that meant she was still fighting. "Hold on," he told her. "Just a little longer." Curtis slammed the door and moved to the driver's side. That's when one of the officers finally found his voice. "You can't! That's a police vehicle! You can't just—" Curtis was already behind the wheel. The engine roared to life. He threw the car into drive and slammed the gas pedal to the floor. The patrol car shot forward, tires screaming against asphalt, and Curtis Bone, crime boss, outlaw, enemy of everything that badge represented, tore through the streets with a dying cop in his back seat. He found the siren switch and flipped it. The wail cut through the evening air, sharp and desperate, clearing traffic like a knife through flesh. Red and blue lights painted the buildings as Curtis pushed the car faster, weaving through intersections, blowing through red lights, driving like the devil himself was chasing him. In a way, the devil was. Just not the one people expected. Behind him, more sirens joined the chorus. The other patrol cars had finally moved, not to stop him, but to follow. A convoy of confusion and chaos, trailing the man they had hunted for years as he raced to save one of their own. Curtis checked the rearview mirror. Morgan was still breathing. Barely. Her eyes were closed, her face ashen, but her chest still rose and fell in shallow, desperate rhythm. "Don't you die on me," he said, his voice rough. "You hear me? Don't you dare die." The hospital was 8 blocks away, then 6, then 4. Curtis had never prayed in his life. Not since his mother died. But somewhere in the back of his mind, in a place he didn't know still existed, he found himself whispering words that might have been a plea to something bigger than himself. Let her live. Please. Let her live. The patrol car screeched to a halt outside the emergency room entrance, leaving black streaks of rubber on the pavement. Curtis didn't bother turning off the engine. He threw open the door and was out before the vehicle had fully stopped rocking on its suspension. He pulled open the back door and lifted Morgan into his arms again. She was lighter now, or maybe that was his imagination, his fear, his understanding that lighter meant less blood, less life, less time. The automatic doors slid open, and Curtis Bone walked into the fluorescent glare of the emergency room. Everything stopped. A nurse at the triage desk looked up from her computer. Her face cycled through confusion, recognition, and terror in the space of a heartbeat. A mother clutching a feverish child pulled her son closer. An old man in a wheelchair rolled himself backward. The security guard at the entrance, a heavyset man with a shaved head and 20 years of working hospital doors, reached for his radio with one hand and his weapon with the other. Curtis knew what they saw. A man covered in blood, arms sleeved in tattoos that told stories of violence and territory and a life lived outside every law society pretended to enforce. A face that had appeared on news broadcasts, in court documents, in whispered warnings passed between cops and criminals alike. They saw a monster walking through the door, and in his arms, a dying police officer. "Security! Security now!" The shout came from somewhere to his left. More guards appeared, 2, then 3, weapons drawn, voices overlapping in a chaos of commands and confusion. "Put her down! Step away from the officer! On the ground! Get on the ground now!" Curtis didn't flinch, didn't slow. He walked straight toward the nearest gurney, an empty one parked against the wall, and laid Morgan down on it with more gentleness than anyone in that room would have believed him capable of. Her blood immediately began soaking into the white sheets. Her breathing was barely visible now, shallow, desperate, fading. Curtis stepped back from the gurney, slowly, deliberately. He raised his hands above his head, palms open, fingers spread. The universal gesture of surrender from a man who had never surrendered anything in his life. "She's a cop," he said. His voice cut through the chaos like a blade, low, steady, commanding. "She's dying. Do your job." The security guards hesitated. Their weapons stayed trained on Curtis, but their eyes kept flicking to Morgan, to the blood spreading beneath her, to the reality that every second they spent pointing guns was a second she was slipping away. A doctor emerged from behind the triage desk. Young, maybe 30, eyes wide but hands steady. She looked at Morgan, then at Curtis, then at the guards. "Lower your weapons," she said. "Ma'am, that's Curtis Bone. We can't just—" "I said lower them." Her voice hardened. "That woman is coding. I need this gurney in Trauma 1 now." The guards didn't holster their weapons, but they stepped aside. Nurses rushed forward, surrounding Morgan, checking vitals, shouting numbers that meant nothing to Curtis, but everything to them. The gurney started moving, wheels squeaking against linoleum as they rushed her through double doors into the bowels of the hospital. Curtis watched her disappear. His hands were still raised, still open, still covered in her blood. The security guards closed in around him. He could feel their fear, their confusion, their desperate need to make sense of something that didn't fit any pattern they understood. A crime boss, saving a cop. A killer surrendering without a fight. A monster standing in the middle of an emergency room asking for nothing but for them to do their jobs. "On your knees," one of them ordered. "Hands behind your head." Curtis lowered himself slowly. The cold floor pressed against his knees. He laced his fingers behind his skull and stared straight ahead, through the doors where Morgan had vanished. "Live," he thought. "You have to live." Because if she died now, after everything, it would mean his mother's ghost was right. That the world didn't change. That help never came in time. That mercy was just another word for losing. They moved Curtis to a plastic chair in the corner of the waiting room. 2 security guards stood on either side of him, hands on their weapons, eyes never leaving his face. A 3rd guard had already called the police. Within minutes, the first patrol cars arrived. Then more. Then more after that. The emergency room transformed into an armed camp. Blue uniforms flooded through the doors, filling the waiting room with tension so thick Curtis could taste it. They lined the walls, blocked the exits, whispered to each other in tight clusters, shooting glances at the man sitting motionless in the corner, still covered in their colleagues' blood. Curtis didn't move, didn't speak, didn't ask for a lawyer or demand his phone call or do any of the things a man in his position should have done. He just waited. The clock on the wall ticked past the minutes. Each one felt like an hour. Each one was another moment Morgan Thompson was somewhere behind those double doors, fighting for her life, or losing the fight entirely. A nurse emerged once. She wouldn't look at Curtis, wouldn't answer the officer's questions, just shook her head and disappeared again. That was 45 minutes ago. Curtis stared at the doors, willing them to open, willing someone to walk through and tell him she was alive. Tell him that for once in his miserable life, he had gotten somewhere in time. The main entrance burst open, and a new energy entered the room. Curtis didn't need to turn his head to know who it was. He could feel the hatred radiating across the waiting room like heat from a furnace. Detective Marcus Warren, Morgan's partner, 15 years on the force, a man who had made it his personal mission to bring down the Bone Syndicate ever since his younger brother got caught in the crossfire of a turf war 8 years ago. The brother survived but never walked again. Warren had never forgiven the streets for that, had never forgiven Curtis, even though the syndicate had nothing to do with it. Some grudges didn't need facts to survive. Warren crossed the waiting room in 6 furious strides. The other officers parted for him, and suddenly he was standing directly in front of Curtis, chest heaving, fists clenched, veins bulging in his neck like he was holding back something that wanted very badly to break free. "What did you do to her?" The words came out low, dangerous, a threat wrapped in a question. Curtis looked up, met Warren's eyes, saw the fury there, but beneath it, something else. Fear. The kind of fear a man feels when his partner, his friend, the person who watches his back every single day, is bleeding out somewhere he can't reach. Curtis understood that fear, had lived with it for 20 years. "I asked you a question." Warren's voice climbed. "What did you do to her, Bone?" The waiting room fell silent. Every officer, every guard, every civilian unfortunate enough to be caught in this moment, all of them watching, waiting, holding their breath. Curtis could have answered, could have explained, could have told Warren exactly what happened on that street, how the officers stood frozen, how he was the only one who moved, how he held her blood in his hands and carried her to safety while her own people watched. But words wouldn't matter. Not to Warren. Not right now. The man had already decided what he believed, and nothing Curtis said would change that. Not until Morgan woke up. Not until she told them herself. If she woke up. So Curtis said nothing. He held Warren's stare. Let the silence speak for itself. Let the accusation hang in the air like smoke from a fire that had already burned everything down. Warren's hand moved toward his weapon. Other officers tensed. The moment balanced on a knife's edge. Then Warren pulled back, stepped away. His eyes never left Curtis, but something in him recognized that this wasn't the time. Not yet. "If she dies," Warren said quietly, "I'll kill you myself." Curtis didn't doubt it. He turned his gaze back to the double doors and continued to wait. 3 hours and 17 minutes. That's how long Curtis sat in that plastic chair, surrounded by men who wanted him dead or locked away forever. That's how long he stared at those double doors, waiting for someone to walk through and deliver a verdict that would either vindicate him or destroy the last piece of his soul that still believed in anything. When the doors finally opened, the entire waiting room went rigid. The surgeon was a tall woman with graying hair pulled back in a tight bun and exhaustion carved into every line of her face. She stripped off her surgical gloves as she walked, her eyes scanning the crowd of blue uniforms until they landed on Detective Warren. "Family of Officer Thompson?" Warren stepped forward. "Partner, she doesn't have family in the city." The surgeon nodded. Took a breath. The pause lasted only a second, but it stretched like eternity. "She's alive." The room exhaled. Officers slumped against walls. Someone whispered a prayer. Warren's shoulders dropped an inch, the only outward sign that he had been holding himself together by sheer force of will. She lost a tremendous amount of blood, the surgeon continued. Another 10 minutes, and we wouldn't be having this conversation. Whoever got her here when they did. Her eyes drifted briefly toward Curtis, still sitting in the corner, still covered in dried blood. Saved her life. Warren's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Curtis felt something loosen in his chest, a knot he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. Morgan Thompson was alive. He had gotten there in time. For once, just this once, help had arrived before it was too late. But the surgeon wasn't finished. There's something else. Her voice dropped. We extracted 2 bullets from her abdomen. Standard protocol is to preserve them for evidence. She hesitated, choosing her next words carefully. Detective, you'll want to get your forensics team involved immediately. The rounds we pulled out, they're police issue, 9mm, consistent with department standard sidearms. The silence that followed was deafening. Warren blinked. What? I'm not a ballistics expert, the surgeon said, but I've seen enough gunshot wounds to know what different ammunition looks like. Those bullets didn't come from a street weapon. They came from a service pistol. Curtis watched the realization ripple through the room, watched faces shift from relief to confusion to something darker, watched officers glance at each other with sudden suspicion, trust fracturing in real time. Morgan Thompson hadn't been ambushed by criminals. She had been shot by one of her own. The doors to the emergency room opened again, and this time a different kind of authority walked through. 2 men in dark suits, badges hanging from their necks, faces carved from stone. Internal affairs. They moved through the crowd like sharks through shallow water, calm, purposeful, utterly unconcerned with the tension their presence created. The lead investigator, a man with silver temples and cold eyes, stopped in front of Warren. Detective, we need to talk. This is my partner's case, Warren started. You should be answering questions. The IA investigator's voice left no room for negotiation. Along with every officer who was on that street today, we have 5 cops who were within 100 feet of an ambush on a fellow officer, and not one of them moved to help. That's not protocol failure. That's conspiracy. Curtis watched as the reality settled over the room. The officers who had stood frozen while Morgan bled. They weren't cowards. They were complicit. They had watched her die on purpose. Someone had wanted her dead, and someone had made sure backup wouldn't arrive. The question was why. Warren's face had gone pale. He looked at Curtis, really looked at him for the first time, and something shifted in his eyes. Not trust, not yet, but doubt. The first crack in the wall of certainty he had built. Curtis met his gaze and said nothing. The truth was emerging, and it was uglier than anyone had imagined. 18 hours later, Morgan Thompson opened her eyes. Curtis was still in the hospital, not in the waiting room anymore. They had moved him to a small administrative office down the hall, 2 officers stationed outside the door like he was a prisoner awaiting sentencing, which, in a way, he was. Internal Affairs had questioned him for 3 hours. He had answered every question, told them exactly what happened, watched their faces shift from skepticism to confusion to something that looked almost like belief. But belief wasn't proof. And until Morgan woke up, Curtis Bone was still the most convenient suspect in a shooting that had torn the department apart. The door opened. Detective Warren stood in the frame, his face unreadable. "She's awake," he said. "She's asking to see you." Curtis didn't move. "Asking to see me, or you're bringing me to her?" Warren's jaw tightened. "Does it matter? Get up." It mattered. But Curtis rose anyway and followed Warren down the corridor, past nurses who stopped mid-stride to stare, past officers who reached for weapons they weren't supposed to draw indoors. The walk felt longer than it should have. Every step carried the weight of what was about to happen. Warren stopped outside room 412. His hand rested on the door handle, but he didn't push it open. Not yet. If you did this, Warren said quietly, if you hurt her and somehow convinced everyone otherwise, I will spend the rest of my life making sure you never see sunlight again. Curtis met his eyes. Open the door. Warren pushed through. The room was small and bright, filled with the hum of machines and the sharp smell of antiseptic. Morgan lay propped against pillows, her face pale, her body wrapped in bandages and IV lines. She looked fragile in a way Curtis hadn't expected. Smaller than the woman who had gripped his arm on that street. Weaker than the fighter who had held on long enough for him to get her here. But her eyes were open, and they were clear. She saw Curtis enter behind Warren, and something flickered across her face. Recognition. Memory. The pieces clicking into place. Warren moved to her bedside. Morgan, thank God. His voice cracked slightly. We need you to tell us what happened. We need you to identify who did this to you. Morgan's gaze shifted to Curtis. Held there. Warren followed her stare. Him. Morgan, was it him? Just say the word and... He saved my life. The words landed like a bomb in the silence. Warren froze. What? Morgan's voice was weak but steady. I was bleeding out. I couldn't move. I couldn't call for help. And he... She looked at Curtis again, something unreadable in her eyes. He was the only one who came. Morgan, that's not... The officers on scene said... The officers on scene watched me die. Her voice hardened despite its fragility. They stood there, Marcus, 100 feet away, weapons drawn, and not one of them moved. She swallowed, pain flickering across her face. The cops who were supposed to back me up, they set me up. They wanted me dead. And the only reason I'm not is because of him. The room fell silent. Warren stared at his partner like he was seeing her for the first time. Like everything he thought he knew had just crumbled beneath his feet. Curtis stood motionless by the door. He had prepared himself for accusation, for hatred. For the moment, Morgan pointed her finger at him and sealed his fate. He had not prepared himself for this, for vindication, for gratitude, for a cop looking at him like he was something other than a monster. He opened his mouth to speak. Nothing came out. For the first time in 20 years, Curtis Bone, the man who always had an answer, always had an angle, always knew exactly what to say to control any room he walked into, was speechless. Morgan held his gaze, and in that silence, something passed between them that neither of them had words for yet. The arrests came fast. Within 72 hours, Internal Affairs had unraveled a conspiracy that reached deeper than anyone expected. 5 officers taken into custody, a sergeant who had orchestrated the ambush, a lieutenant who had looked the other way. Morgan Thompson had been getting too close to something. A network of dirty cops running protection for drug operations on the South Side, and someone had decided she needed to be silenced. They had almost succeeded. The story broke across every news channel in the city. A black female officer, ambushed by her own department, left to die while her colleagues watched. And the man who saved her, the notorious crime boss Curtis Bone, became something no one knew how to categorize. Hero, villain, both, neither. The district attorney came to Curtis 3 days after the arrests. A woman with sharp eyes and a sharper reputation, she sat across from him in a sterile conference room and laid out an offer that would have made any defense attorney weep with joy. Full immunity. Every charge, past, present, pending, wiped clean, in exchange for his testimony against the corrupt officers and his cooperation in dismantling what remained of their network. Curtis listened. Let her finish. Then shook his head. No deal. The DA blinked. Mr. Bone, I don't think you understand what I'm offering. This is a clean slate, complete immunity. You walk away from everything. I heard you. Curtis leaned back in his chair. And I said no. Then why would you testify at all? Curtis was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was lower than before. rougher, like the words were coming from somewhere he didn't visit often. Some debts can't be paid with freedom, he testified anyway. Took the stand, told the truth, watched the officers who had let Morgan bleed get led away in handcuffs, while cameras flashed and reporters shouted questions no one could answer. The trial lasted 2 weeks. Curtis was there for every day of it. On the final morning, before the verdict came down, he stepped outside the courthouse for air. The spring sun was warm on his face, and for a moment the world felt almost peaceful. Curtis. He turned. Morgan Thompson stood 10 feet away, leaning on a cane she clearly hated using. She was thinner than before, paler, but her eyes were the same, sharp, steady, unbroken. She walked toward him slowly. No smile, no extended hand. Just two people meeting in the space between what they had been and what they had become. "Guilty verdict's coming down in an hour," she said. "Thought you'd want to know." "I figured." Silence stretched between them. Not uncomfortable, just heavy with everything that couldn't be said. Morgan looked at him for a long moment, studying his face like she was trying to solve a puzzle that didn't have a solution. "You didn't have to save me," she said finally. "You had every reason to walk away. Every reason to let me die." Curtis held her gaze. Thought about his mother. Thought about the boy he used to be. Thought about 20 years of walls and blood and the cold certainty that mercy was just another way to lose. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I did." Morgan didn't argue, didn't push. She just nodded, a small gesture that carried more weight than any words could have. Curtis turned and started walking down the courthouse steps. He didn't look back. Didn't need to. Some things didn't require goodbyes. Behind him, Morgan watched him go. The crime boss, the monster, the man every cop in the city had sworn to destroy. The only human in the room. She watched until he disappeared around the corner, swallowed by the city that had made them both. Then she turned and walked back inside to hear the verdict. The sun kept shining. The world kept turning. And somewhere in the distance, the sound of sirens faded into nothing.